Hi, everyone. My name is Avery Lavoie, and I'm an aspiring death doula and host of today's show with Michelle Acciavatti. And she is a natural death care worker and the founder of the Vermont Forest Cemetery, the first natural burial ground in Vermont. She's also a licensed funeral director, death doula, pregnancy loss guide, home funeral guide, end-of-life specialist, and natural burial educator. And in 2016, she created the Green Mountain Funeral Alternatives to help people preparing for the end of life, designing funeral services, caring for their own dead, and exploring natural burial options. Michelle has practiced death work with people of all ages, including death during pregnancy. Her work has found her in settings as varied as the forest, Boston Children's Hospital, and people's own living rooms, as well as the traditional funeral home. So welcome, Michelle.
Thank you.
One of the first questions I want to start with is one that Krista Tippett from On Being often starts on their podcast, and it's can you share a little bit about your spiritual upbringing and maybe how that led you to death work?
Yeah. So it's interesting because I was raised in a very agnostic household. So I don't have any sort of formal religious upbringing, although my parents both came from more formal. My mom was raised Catholic and my dad, and whichever Protestant church had the best organ at the at the time. I think it was like mostly Lutheran because it was Minnesota. But so, I was raised, they were also scientists. So I was raised to question. And anytime I had a question about things, my parents would ask me, what do you think? So it was why is the sky blue? Why do you think the sky is blue? And I was also really exposed to death and dying. And so I think that I was always really interested in kind of why things are the way they are. And then, so I kind of defined my spirituality in terms of like things that I was not for a really long time. And then 2 years ago, I got really sick. And I was reading Braiding Sweetgrass. And Robin Wall Kimmerer describes this concept of reciprocity, this way of being deeply in gratitude with certain things. And she takes readers through this exercise where, if you're eating something, to imagine, right, that this was once something living and not just that it's been sacrificed for you to eat it, but the hands that, grew it or raised it or, tended to it, and everybody that worked to get it, to your plate. And that when you're eating it, to like really be mindful of that whole thing. And so I was really sick and I was thinking, okay, what if our ultimate, sort of purpose is to be in reciprocity with the gift of life itself, and how do we really give back to what does it mean to be alive on this planet, and how do we give back to it? And that was sort of this big open door for me in terms of sort of taking off into the way I really think about the world. And so I think now that most of what my spirituality is defined as is this way of how do I really deeply appreciate what it means to be alive in all of its complexity. Right, and then how do I make my life one of service and of giving back to the people and to the land that make it possible for me to have this existence?
Yeah, so this experience of your own illness in reading this book, Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, of reciprocity of life, allowed you to think about how you might give back to the earth and in service to your community.
Yeah, and it was so interesting because I've always been drawn to natural burial, but I was in the process of trying to get the cemetery off the ground. But it really changed the whole concept of the cemetery for me, from something that was a burial ground, right, to this place to really celebrate and honor life, and the fact that we humans tend to think of ourselves as above the ecosystem, right? It's something that we control and manipulate, and we're not. We're absolutely a very integral part of it, and it is an integral part of us. There is no separation, right, between, we define natural communities as not man-made, but, human and natural communities are entirely interdependent. And so how to make the cemetery, a metaphor for that, but also a living practice of that became a central question to what we were doing when we were trying to get open.
Great. And yeah, can you talk a little bit, since we're transitioning into the forest cemetery, can you tell us a little bit about how that got off the ground and what year and where you're at now?
Yeah. So when I came to Vermont in 2014, natural burial wasn't fully legal here, really at all. And there was a movement to legalize natural burial grounds. So our definition of cemeteries at the time included things like fencing and paths, and none of this was really consistent with the practice of natural burial. And so I came on the tail end of redefining natural burial grounds as cemeteries that were exempt from all of these sort of restrictions and ways that people could really give their bodies back to the earth. But the other thing that existed at the time was a mandatory burial depth of 5 feet. And that's not consistent with natural burial because it cuts the body off from heat and oxygen and the mycelial network. So
which is needed to decompose.
To decompose the body and return the body actually to the ecosystem. And so I went through taking up where the first movement had left off. So in 2016, I'm walking around the state house pretty much every day asking various legislators if they wanted to talk about the relationship between burial depth and natural burial. I was incredibly popular at lunchtime, which is the best time to find somebody at the state house if you want to talk to them. But and it really solidified for me that this is absolutely something that I wanted for myself and I wanted to make possible for myself. You know, it started as kind of this intellectual exercise of, oh, we have this, but we don't quite have it all the way and I should finish it. And then, you know, here I am talking to people about why they should make it legal. And it's like, oh no, like I want this. And in order to support the bill, I traveled all around the state and I went to 9 different communities and gave library talks about, yes, we have natural burial grounds now, but we need to change this final piece and talking about what's really the science of natural burial and what's happening and why this was so important. And I mean, I met with hundreds of people, right? And all of them were like, no, I want this and I want this for myself. And so it was both this idea of I wanted it, but the community wanted it. And there was this big collective effort and the bill passed almost unanimously. And then I took a step back thinking that someone else would start, because so many people were inspired by this. Somebody else would, of course, start the cemetery. And I went to mortuary school and was working in the conventional funeral home. And the pandemic happened and nobody had been able to successfully start a cemetery dedicated to natural burial. And so I was a bit frustrated with death care and decided that I would start the cemetery and you know, the one and make it possible for Vermonters to actually have a cemetery dedicated to natural burial and give their loved ones back to the land in this way.
Yeah, which is the first in Vermont.
Yeah, so we're the first natural burial cemetery dedicated to natural burial ground. There's about a dozen cemeteries now in Vermont that have natural burial sections in them, but there's cemeteries that look like cemeteries. And so this is the first that's in the woods. So we're the first forest cemetery. We're also the first conservation burial ground, so a cemetery that's dedicated to conservation principles as well.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the difference between a forest cemetery versus just a natural burial ground and perhaps the ecological differences there might be in using a forest cemetery versus just doing a natural burial in a kind of a traditional cemetery?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, to work in reverse, you know, there's one of my mentors that says that every natural burial is a good burial, regardless of where it is and what's going on, right? As long as the body is returned to the earth at, you know, a relatively, and I'm going to say shallow depth, but the body is still very much protected, and we can talk about that. But, you know, in this ability to return to the ecosystem, right? The ecosystem is going to benefit from that burial. What changes is how do we manage the land that's around it. So if you have a natural burial section and say that that's a little wildflower meadow in a very landscaped cemetery, right? That little meadow is still doing really great things for the environment. What changes is when you start to move out into a completely natural environment. And so I think a lot of natural burial grounds are in meadows. And it's not so much about ecological impact as much as just ease of access. It's a lot easier to work in a meadow. You're not working around trees and roots and various other things. So in the forest burial, we're actually burying people in the forest, not right at the base of trees because the roots get in the way and we try to disturb those as little as possible. But the idea is that the ecosystem that we're giving the body to is a forest instead of a meadow. But I think overall, anytime you give somebody's body back to the earth, the environment benefits. What we've been able to do is the land that we ended up creating the cemetery on is land that, first of all, we don't know about the indigenous history of the land, but it was settled by colonial settlers in the late 1700s, and it was farmed until they used up the soil, because they didn't know anything about regenerative farming. And then it was abandoned, and it was used for hay, and then it was a timber tract, and it was logged. So this is a piece of land that can really benefit from a little bit of extra care and attention. And so we come in with this idea of, we're not just giving these bodies back to the forest. We want the forest to be as healthy as possible. And so we can start to think about, all right, most of the trees that have come up in our forest are the more weedy species, the ones that are going to come up first. It's not necessarily a healthy species balance in the forest. We have a lot more red maple than sugar maple, for example, right? So the idea is that, can we now steward this land in back to full health? And what does it mean that the climate is changing? So we're taking that into consideration as well. So it allows us to really shape this forest for the future, in addition to helping it be as healthy as it can be today, in addition to just being a really beautiful natural setting that so many Vermonters are drawn to. We're not a prairie state. We don't have natural big open meadows. We come here for the mountains and for the forests.
Right.
So, to be able to return your loved one to something, to a place that they have really cherished in life, even if they've never been to our particular forest before, which most people haven't, is, I think, a really special opportunity for most people in Vermont, and that's what we wanted to give them.
Yeah, I really appreciate the intersection between conservation, culture, and spirituality that the Forest Cemetery can offer. And I know I've heard a lot of folks have some misconceptions about green or natural burials, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to what folks' fears around natural burial might be, both from the perspective of, would animals dig it up or that kind of thing, and also the kind of cultural, spiritual, maybe fears that people might have.
Yeah. I would say, particularly when I was traveling around the state for legalization, or when people come to the cemetery for tours, the main concerns that people have is, are animals going to dig up this person that I love? But also, is this body going to contaminate the water supply? Because we hear a lot about chemicals that come from human use that are in water. And then the big concern that's come up in the last year or so is flooding.
Yeah.
But also, is my family going to like this? I don't know anybody that's going to want to come to the woods and see me bury, right? These are all concerns that people have. And so the really interesting thing is that this is a natural process, and nature knows so much better than we do, right? We have tried for centuries now to improve on nature with science, and we can't really. And so this is a process that's been evolving as long as anything has been alive and dying on the surface of the earth. Is we are made of nutrients, and the planet wastes nothing. And so when we die, those nutrients are meant to be recycled back into the ecosystem. And the most efficient way to do that is actually not to bury anybody at all and just be on the surface. But we don't do that with people we love for obvious reasons, and also it's not legal. But so when we bury the dead, we're turning them into nutrients that can be distributed into the soil. And what that means is that the entire body breaks down. So the issue of animals being attracted to grave sites, right? Animals have to have a smell to follow, and those smells are organic chemicals that are released as the body decomposes. And soil can break those down, healthy soil, along with everything else in the body. And so we settled on a burial depth of 3.5 feet when we changed the law in Vermont, because that allows, in most cases, to have over 2 feet of soil on top of the body. And that is both a physical and a chemical barrier for the smells. So it's a chemical barrier because the soil is decomposing the smells before they reach the surface. It's also a physical barrier because scavengers are also prey animals, and they don't want to exhaust themselves in getting a meal when, for the most part, things are dying right on the surface. And in the forest, there's plenty of easy things for them to eat. So even if they were, for some reason, to know that there was a body there, that's way too much work to have happen. And people, hear 3.5 feet and they think that's not very deep, and they say, oh, but my dog once dug up a bone in the garden and things like that. And it is really, I'm 5 feet tall. If I were to stand up, 3.5 feet is up to here on me.
Yeah.
So it's much deeper than people think. And there are some things where skunks and possums and animals that scavenge for grubs and things come to the freshly turned soil, but they're not going for the gravesite. And then somebody will say, okay, well, like woodchucks will dig really, really deep burrows. They can dig 4 feet down. And I'm like, okay, well, we don't have a woodchuck population in our forest, but also, what do you think is going to happen? That they'll burrow underneath the body and somehow force it up out of the ground, So we don't really worry about that. And that's the wonderful thing that science can offer, is a better understanding of what nature is doing, right?
Yeah.
So there's that. And so then that raises the question too that people have about frost, and frost heaves rocks and discarded automobiles and things out of the ground all the time. Those are big solid objects for frost to work on over time. The body is breaking down in the soil, so there's just nothing that is realistically going to disturb the body once it's buried. And the same principle then of why nothing is reaching the surface from the body is why nothing from the body is going to reach the water supply. So the things that we worry about in our water supply, hormones, chemotherapy, drugs, antidepressants, again, are all organic substances. So when we changed the law, so we set the burial depth at 3.5 feet, and the prior change to the law had said that anytime you create a new cemetery in Vermont, it has to follow reasonable siting distances from water, particularly from drinking water. And this came out of when Irene, the hurricane, stalled out in Vermont, and we had that horrible flooding in 2013, was that?
After.
Yeah. There have been so many floods since then now, it's hard to keep track of when was what. But after Irene, and there were actually cemeteries where caskets were disturbed and released from the ground, and that was upsetting for a lot of people. So we wanted to make sure that didn't happen again.
Right.
Because most cemeteries in Vermont had been sited where you can't farm and you can't build, and that's a flood zone. So first of all, we're well out of any flood zones because we follow the statutory guidelines. We are 1,800 feet up a mountain, and we're on a pretty steep slope. So if we did have, we occasionally have had some of our streams with some flash flooding issues. Our trails get soggy, but the water runs downhill. And we don't worry about the bodies being dislodged, and we also don't worry about anything from the body reaching a major waterway or a drinking supply before it has time to break down in the soil. And one of the exciting things is we've met a bunch of people through getting the cemetery started who have started to think about how we could actually design experiments to look at what really is going on in under the ground and what's happening. And so we're going to, again, bring science to bear in terms of helping us better understand how the soil is doing all of this. Because soil, we say soil is magic, but it's not actually magic, right?
So how seem like that.
Yeah, how do we better understand all of that? And it also raises the question for us of what do we do here up on this hill to protect towns down in the valley from the water usage? We have this big forest, and can we make the forest spongier and better able to absorb the water that's moving down it? Because what we've done so far is put in a road, which creates an impermeable surface. So what can we do to kind of create more bioswales? And it's talking about stewarding the forest for the future, and with climate change, well, more rain is going to be a big part of that. So are there species that are going to do better in the wet and act as sponges and help better absorb water, so less of it is traveling downstream to the villages and the low-lying areas?
Right, so you're providing many different services in this forest, like you would any kind of conserved forest, and your primary focus on building the soil to reduce erosion and preserve the water, and you're also providing this conserved forest for people to walk through and enjoy, and you're providing this cultural and spiritual service. And that's initially what really drew me to natural burial through the death doula program at UVM. Learned a little bit about it. Was this, the reciprocity of it. What can I give my body back to, and can I be a part of that which has given me so much? Also, growing up in Vermont and just being part of the forest for so much of my life, and really having that privilege, and knowing that my body could give the gift of supporting a forest is really beautiful. And one of the concerns that I have is the aspect of pollution, like formaldehyde or the parts of the casket that might not break down for a very long time. And then also in traditional cemeteries, I'm wondering if, likely there's very little soil and pretty compacted soil. So it is this, while it can be this beautiful place to come and visit, and I personally love visiting cemeteries, I can imagine that, being able to go to this forest and visit a loved one that is also close to a tree that I love. Have you had any folks tell you stories or share about why this experience was so important to them?
Yeah, it's really interesting because most of the people that have found us, so we've done 16 burials, we'll do 17 this week, are people that have been just Googling after death. And, it's like they've vaguely heard about natural, but, they haven't heard of us already. So they're not looking for us. They're looking, how can I do a natural burial? And, in the reasons vary. So in one, as the man was dying, he actually lived in Massachusetts where there aren't good natural burial options. And he dreamed he became a shepherd in the Green Mountains as he was dying. And so his widow was Googling, green burial, Green Mountains, and found us and said, can you bury somebody from Massachusetts? And, we said we could. We'd prefer people be buried closer to home, but when there's no other options, that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
So that was really just sort of a man that had a deep connection with nature and then had this dream of, of where, and, he would give his body back to the earth in these Green Mountains. And our land at one point had a sheepfold on it, and they raised sheep on it. So, now we actually have a shepherd on our land. So, so there's that. And, just tons of people, grew up in the woods, loved the woods, always wanted to go back to the woods. And then when you really think about our conventional burial practices, cemeteries are gorgeous and headstones are so interesting and there's so many stories and they spark our imagination. Mm-hmm. But for the last 100 years, 150 years or so, in order to be buried in a cemetery, you're not only embalmed, but you're placed in a casket that's usually sealed. And then in Vermont, that casket goes inside a concrete liner in the ground, right? Mm-hmm. And so there is no exchange of nutrients with the environment. You're not going back to the earth. And I think that this comes from a place of love. We want to memorialize our dead. We want to think of them kind of like Cinderella, just forever that way underneath the ground. But when you really start to think about that, I think it becomes less comforting when you think about it. And so I think there's just a lot of people that are facing death and needing to make decisions either for themselves or for somebody that they love, and are realizing that they haven't been to a funeral that's resonated with them or helped them with their grief process at all in a long time. Mm-hmm. And they don't want that. They want something that is meaningful, that it speaks to their spirituality, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that this really captures people's imaginations in this new way. And so I think that I would say probably for every single one of our families, whether they're conscious of it or not, the idea that really draws them to us is this idea that instead of being memorialized on a headstone, you become part of the life of a forest. Mm-hmm. And we see our responsibility at the cemetery of our ecosystem is now supported by these bodies, but these stories are as much a part of the ecosystem as well. And so most people are not choosing to have headstones. You can have one as long as it's not set in a concrete base. But, how do we memorialize these stories? How do we keep these stories? How do people's stories live on the same way that the trees and the other plants in the forest are with them? And so that's been really wonderful to see the various ways that families have entrusted us, not just with the bodies of these people that they love, but also their stories and who they were. And at least internally, we have nicknames for everybody that we've buried that reminds us of exactly who they are. Yeah. And, I grew up, I was raised by academics, I was raised in science, I was a very rational thinker, and I've been a death worker for the last 10 years. And, I get more and more woo the more that I go on. But at this point, I have conversations with the people that are buried at the cemetery. They are some of them are off doing their own thing, but some of them are really very present. And that's just been really, really interesting to really feel like there's this whole community of souls, whatever you want to believe they are, that become a part, souls, or, at least stories. And I find it really comforting to be surrounded by these lives rather than the bodies of their dead.
The lives and their stories. And that was one of the reasons why I did the death doula program, was to get in touch with some of my fears around death. And I've had young friends pass, and really wanting to become more comfortable with my own mortality as a mid-30s, and knowing that there is so much beauty and sacredness to death. And I have the blessing of having a lot of friends that are really open to talking about their end of life and what they might want. And I found myself like almost excited to be in relationship to death, knowing that there are alternatives like forest cemeteries. And that when I hear you talk about these stories that are very alive, I go from a place of growing up with an idea of, this fear, or being in like a haunted forest, or like at Halloween being very afraid of all the sort of violent imagery, versus in our culture that really separates and disconnects us from the sacredness of death. And then learning about other traditions and indigenous ways of caring for the dead and being with their spirit after the dead. It really makes me feel alive in the moment, because I know that there are people that care about the stories and care about supporting the spirit.
Yeah. And first, you're so lucky to have friends that are open to talking about this. Because when I got started, it's like I used to just ruin dinner all the time, because it's like I love this, and I would talk about it, and people are like, oh God, here she goes again. And now my whole family is really into this. And I tell this story. I was at my little cousin's wedding, and she was raised in a very strict religious household. So literally, her first kiss was the kiss at her wedding. And as they're smooching, one of my adult cousins leans over to me and says, "Can I have one of those natural burial things?" And I was like, time and place, we're not gonna. So, people came around to it, but in the beginning, I found it really isolating to be into this, until I started to kind of find my people and connect with people and mentors and other people doing the work. But that point about Halloween and the violent imagery, we're both afraid of death, and we're incredibly removed from it. And this is something that I was just talking about this earlier today. We have an almost primal connection to death care. This is something we have been caring for, the bodies of people since before we were Homo sapiens, right? And returning them to the earth in one way or the other. This is a deep, deep primal urge to care for this body, and and whether or not we know it, but to give it back to the earth and to allow it to then feed the earth and continue this cycle. And I just think that there's something that, capitalism, marketing, death care and the state of it now came from this place of, we really did. We wanted to care for and honor and protect the bodies of the people that we love. But that meant that we were treating them with more and more, with chemicals, with embalming, and we needed professionals to do it. And we took death out of the community and put it into this funeral home, this very specific place for death care. And therefore it became something that the rest of us didn't need to think about. I've heard funeral directors describe their work as dealing with the unpleasant reality of a body after death, right? And is it really so unpleasant, or is it just really unfamiliar? And it's remarkable, because it's only been about 150 years that we weren't all around when somebody was laid out at home, right, and cared for at home and in community. And so, the community piece, right? You've highlighted it. It's really important to us. And that's something that we really want to bring into the cemetery. So I was talking about, I wanted the cemetery to be more about than burial, more than a place for burial. And we used to be cared for by our communities, right? And then buried in our communities, whether it was our church or our farm or our community center. But it was very much in service of where we lived, and therefore how we lived, and therefore who we were. And the other thing that I think that's changed in the last 150 years is it's become almost rote. You know, there's a professional that handles the death. There's very specific things about the person that are memorialized. The burial or cremation is a very specific thing. And so much of the life is missing from those ceremonies. So for people that are going to choose to give their bodies back to our forest and become a part of the community and be honored in this way, right, by the people that love them, our forest, like I said, is not a place that many people have visited. It's not necessarily going to resonate. It's not a part of their community. So we really want to try to build community at the forest. And we also want to think about different ways that we take from the forest and take from the earth and life, right? We don't just take nutrients, so we don't just need to return nutrients. We want to create a small artist colony because we can take inspiration and then leave a piece of art. You know, you can take a question and leave with some knowledge. So we'll have a small research station. So the 5 branches of the cemetery are burial, conservation, but then also art, learning, and community. And we're hoping that people will come in with questions that the forest can answer and then turn that into an opportunity for people to come and learn along with them or learn what they learned. Or come and create a piece of art inspired by the forest, and people can come and engage with that piece of art and be inspired in turn. We're open as a park from dawn to dusk any day of the year that somebody wants to come. And not that Vermont lacks beautiful forests for people to go to, but again, this idea that what can this forest offer us and how to create a meaningful community so that, you know, the body can be in service not just of the forest, but in this whole vibrant community. And that way, you know, when we're holding people's stories, we're really holding every aspect of them and not just their connection to the environment or the natural world or their love for it. And it's an act of love. It's an act of love to give your body back to the world in this way. But we are all so much more than that as well. And so we want to honor and create the opportunity for all that to be reflected in what we do too.
That's really beautiful. And you've shared with me a little bit some of the ways that folks can get involved. Would you like to share a little bit about how folks might get involved in the Roxbury Forest Cemetery in search of meaning and life? And if they're interested in natural burial too.
Yeah, I mean, just, to like the easiest thing is like if anybody's like inspired by what I just said and is like, ooh, like I know something about the forest, I know trees, I know birds, I know a poem or something. I mean, it's like literally just write to us and say, I would like to lead a workshop. I would like to lead a tree walk. I would like to do a performance in your forest. We can't, at this point, we are a nonprofit. We just got started, so we can't pay you for what you're doing. But, if you want to come in and offer that, like that's just a really wonderful way. The most important way that you can help us is to volunteer your time. So on our website, we have an events list, and we have a trail work day every month. We have 2 in September because we're going to have a birthday party in October.
What's the date for that?
It'll be over Indigenous Peoples Day weekend, either the Saturday or the Sunday of the weekend. We have to see what most people can do. And that will be on our website, and it'll go out in our newsletter. I think it's one Sunday a month. We invite people to come and help us with trail work. And it's nice to have hardy people that, are able to do work, but there's something for people of all abilities. So we are along a road and people throw cans down. And so, you want to walk around and help us pick up cans, or even just walking on the trails helps, create them in the forest. So you can just come and walk around. And so it doesn't have to be physically demanding labor to come and help. We also, so natural burial is a participatory event. It's usually the responsibility of the family to bear the body to the grave site, to lower it into the grave, and to fill the grave back in. And that's wonderful when people have robust intergenerational communities to support them in this, and that's really not the norm. And so we've created a core of volunteers that can come and support us on burial days, where again, a range of abilities of things that are needed. So people that can come and bear witness and just be present with families at the gravesite are important. People that can help with the carrying, with the lowering, with the filling are important as well. And so we generally need a crew of, depending on the size of the family, but we try to have at least 3 people to support the family at every burial. And that's a difficult one for most people because we don't get a lot of notice. It's often during the week kind of thing. But when people can come and help, and I think that it's also a really wonderful way to see what this is like. You know, we talked about one of the concerns is, how do I get my family on board with this decision, right? What are they going to think of it? Well, I think that what I have found is for everybody that's had this experience, it's transformative. And this is a way to have the experience without having to go through somebody that you know dying, in a way of being really in community and supportive of somebody that is going through the profound grief of somebody that they love dying. So those are things. We will be launching a fundraiser in September. So we one of the first things we did is we built a road through the cemetery. Most natural burial grounds are in natural settings, and that can make them difficult to access if you have any type of physical limitation. And access is really important to us. And so we're not where we need to be yet, but we've been working really hard from the beginning to make sure that we're at least semi-accessible for people of all physical abilities. And we've been able to open up an entire trail system now into the heart of the forest on the north side, and we'd like to be able to extend the vehicle road down through this fall. So we do have a fundraiser, and we understand that, you know, not everybody can give, but even just if you follow us on social media, reposting the call and telling people about it and things like that can really help. So it really is. We're using the phrase an ecosystem of support. You know, the forest has many, many sources of nutrients and life, you know, and people's time is incredibly valuable to us, and people's money is very helpful as well. So those are kind of the primary ways that people can get involved. Ideally over time, so you're an aspiring death doula. I said when I got started in this work that I had 3 goals. One was for everybody in Vermont to understand what their end-of-life options were. And for that, I started Green Mountain Funeral Alternatives, which we can talk about too. But also for everybody to have access to natural burial. And so that's the cemetery. So we've done that. And the third is for people to actually be able to have the death and the dying experience that they want. And most people in Vermont really cherish their independence and living at home, and so dying at home is really important to them. And death doulas can be a really important role, both in educating people about how to do that, but supporting people through that process. And so we would like to create, through the cemetery, a network of doulas and people that are trained to help people lay out their own dead, so that anybody in Vermont that's looking for some extra support has a way to access somebody that can help them. And what's fabulous about that is the cemetery has been such a great integrator, community builder. And so there is a woman, Casey March, that started, it started as the Vermont Death Doula Network. It is now the Northeast Death Doula Network. And so she's creating the network of doulas, and so we can start to connect to that. And, you know, and I'm also trained as a home funeral guide. So if people want to come and learn about how to lay out the dead and the after death care, how to talk about natural burial, those are opportunities that over the next year we want to start creating for people as well. So people can get involved. You know, you don't have to want to get your hands dirty in the forest to support the cemetery as well. You can support our families in many different ways. So those opportunities will be growing as well.
Right. I was really grateful to talk to Casey, and their network seems amazing. And UVM Death Doula program also has a network that they're starting with Francesca Arnaldi, who also has a death literacy specialist program. And so I think that this field is really growing, and it's a really important time, as we've talked so much about our kind of cultural disconnect from death. And so I think that with your mentorship and folks like Francesca and Casey, that we have really amazing potential to grow support for death care in the state. And you mentioned the Green Mountain Funeral Alternatives. Can you share a little bit about that?
So people kind of say, what is the most important thing I can do for natural burial? And I mean, the most important thing is to tell people that that's what you want. But planning is probably the second most important thing. So we have caught families that, you know, again, somebody has just died, they want to do this, and we're taking them, you know, through the entire process of planning for a natural burial in the couple of days that we have to get ready for a burial. And we can do it, but it is more stressful. And the more prepared you are for this, the more you understand what your values are, the easier it is for you to kind of have everything that you want respected when you've died. So I initially started Green Mountain Funeral Alternatives to support myself as a death doula when I was primarily doing the work of taking people through dying. And it became really clear to me, and and again, this was 10 years ago, so it's been a big change in the knowledge of death doulas, and the Vermont Death Doula program, and a bunch of different training programs exist now. But most people I talked to had no idea what a doula was, why they might need one. They had not thought about how they wanted to die necessarily. I mean, they thought about how they didn't want to, but the how do you actually put that into place part was missing. And so I kind of began to expand from death doula work to advanced care planning and getting people to think about this. And ultimately, we die the way we live. And so my goal is to help people connect with their values for living, and that will help inform their choices that they will make about dying. And people that work with me get two things. So if they want, they get an advance directive. It's a legally binding document that documents their wishes, and I'll take them through the process of who should be your advocate. So who speaks for you when you're dying, and then who speaks for you after you've died, to make sure that your wishes are respected. What are those wishes, and why are those your wishes? So that if you can't communicate them for yourselves, these people that are representing you can make the best decisions on your behalf. The other thing that people have is a step-by-step plan. So from the time that dying starts to the time of burial, whether it's at Vermont Forest Cemetery or on your own property or in one of these other cemeteries that do natural burial, what needs to happen? Where are you going to be? Who needs to support you through your dying process? After you die, what happens? Who gets called when? What happens to your body? All of this is written out. And the final piece is I did this work for a number of years before I realized that if you don't know how you're going to pay for your plan, what you have is a wish list. And so I really also try to connect people to what their resources are, what community resources exist to support their planning process. What can hospice do? What can hospice not do? Why would you want to hire a death doula? What agencies can fill in the blanks that maybe your family isn't able to provide for you? And most retirement planners will have people put aside money for their funeral, but that's kind of the least expensive part of end of life ultimately. I mean, funerals can get very expensive, but the cost of dying and the medical care, and particularly for people that might need additional support, such as being in a facility, these are the things that often catch people unawares. And then, like all things in Vermont, we struggle right now with the ability to fund and fully staff these incredible programs that do exist to support people. So again, the better prepared you are for what resources exist and what their limitations are, and how do you figure out everything that you need. It is so much easier to do that now in your 30s, right? And then just continue. I tell people, think of Leap Day as, right, it happens every 4 years, get out your documents, review them, kind of thing. But, just to really be able to get into it now when it's not a crisis. So that's my goal, is for everybody to have a plan and be prepared to die in accordance with their own, ethics and values, and then also have what happens to their body follow that same continuum. And my favorite way of helping people through this is when everything happens in the home. So the dying happens in the home, the body is cared for in the home, the burial either happens in the home or at Vermont Forest Cemetery or another cemetery, but it happens in, supported by the home community. And we're really going back to the way that we did things before the funeral industry became an industry and took all this off of people's hands. But there's a real role for the funeral industry to play. Again, not everybody has the ability to be cared for by their loved ones. Not everybody's loved ones want to do it. Not everybody wants their loved ones to care for their body, right? And so I also, as a funeral director, help people connect with funeral directors that are going to support them and carry out their wishes as well. And so that allows me to really serve everybody's needs, really from dying to death in a way that really fits what it is that they need, that they can afford, and that they have the resources for in terms of community support.
Yeah, and there are so many questions and so many topics we could speak to in this moment. I have a couple of things. If folks in their towns are interested in natural burial. I know in my town, Huntington, there have been folks that have been working to figure out if natural burial is possible in either existing cemeteries or if it's possible to find some conserved land. So if folks are interested in their towns, what would you say might be the first kind of steps?
So I think the first step for anybody is to approach their local cemetery commissioner or commission in general and see what's possible in the community. Is there a cemetery that has space that might be consistent with creating a small natural burial section? And if there's reluctance on the part of the cemetery commissioner, this is very, very different from the way that people run cemeteries. And we talked about concrete vaults. They make cemetery maintenance really easy. And most cemeteries in Vermont close from November to May. So we're asking cemeteries to make big changes in the way that they operate. So this is a source of trepidation for a lot of existing cemetery commissions. So have the initial conversation, see what's possible. And then, I do make community appearances. We're working on training up board members and volunteers for people that really understand this, that can go in and meet with cemetery commissioners and talk through what their concerns are. We have this documentary that was created that follows the first burial and the opening of our cemetery, as well as some work that's happening at the third oldest natural burial ground in the United States, which is in Ithaca, New York. Wow. So that people can get a sense of being able to see what this is like and how it would kind of work. So that's, sort of the first. And the second is to really build community support for this. So this is what made it so possible to change the laws in Vermont really quickly, which is not something that usually happens in Vermont. Nothing happens quickly in Vermont. But if you can inspire people in your community to get involved in this, I think that, and particularly people that might be willing to, assist with maybe helping out with the cemetery. So maybe there's landscape artists that can think about how do we manage this land in an ecologically sound manner if we create it as a cemetery. People that can start to think about how do we support families. If we're going to be hand filling these graves, that's not something that most cemeteries have staff to do. So where is that staff going to come from? And things like that. But also just in general to build the support, because if one person goes to the cemetery commissioner, they might be sympathetic, but they're not going to change everything they know for one person. But if the majority of a community is coming and saying, hey, we really want to figure out how to make this work, then it becomes a group problem solving exercise of how do we meet these community needs. And that's, municipal cemeteries exist to serve community needs. So it may mean changing the way that we do things, but how can the community come together to support that change? And also, how can the community come together to make it an economically viable change for a community to take on, right? So again, the more people that are advocating for something, the easier it is to find solutions to the places where it's easy for one person to get stuck in their thought process, right? But if you've got a whole group, you can generally come up with some pretty cool solutions for those stuck places.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really super helpful. And one thing I also wanted to note is this part about access. And financial access, but also cultural access and language access. So if you're someone that is new to this country or not speaking English, or is an Indigenous person or a person of color in this community and curious about natural burial, you've mentioned Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and hosting the kind of birthday over Indigenous Peoples Day. I think of green burial almost in response to maybe more colonial processes, death traditions, and sort of a response to and saying, that this land matters to us. Yeah. And so there's kind of a lot of things wrapped up in that question, but I think I'm just speaking a little bit to the social justice piece of death care in Vermont. I know that, having more death doulas of color, more death doulas who speak Spanish might be really important. Is there anything that you're working with in that space?
I mean, I think one thing is to really kind of challenge the concept of like what is even normal. So particularly for a lot of new Americans, these traditions, you know, are still very solid in their communities. The United States is one of the few countries that really kind of consistently embalms their dead and works with professionals for death care. So understanding that, you know, they might not call it natural burial or home funerals, but that there's many people in Vermont for whom this is already an existing tradition, right? And how do we honor that, and how do we facilitate them having access to their own traditional ways of doing things? And so I think that ultimately, for any death doula or home funeral guide or anybody that, you know, wants to claim the label of death worker, to be very humble about what people have to teach us about their own experiences is the, you know, is the primary thing. And then, yes, what are the needs in our community? Do we need doulas that speak Spanish or Farsi or, right, something like that? I think the other is to look at who is often othered and left out in these conversations. We tend to, and I know that, you know, I took 9 different trainings. They were all taught by white people from a certain background. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it is very much a silo, and reinforcing these ideas and these values of what a good death looks like, or what people are going to want at the end of death, and to really, or end of life rather, to really challenge those preconceptions for ourselves and look at, okay, who was never mentioned in these conversations? Who was never mentioned in this training? Whose face didn't I see across the table from me in these, and why are people missing, and how do we make spaces more inclusive? One of the things that we recognize is at Vermont Forest Cemetery is we are in a remote rural location. We are up a dirt hill, you know, pretty much in the middle of nowhere. We don't have cell service. There's a ton of people that aren't, for whatever reason, going to feel comfortable coming to the cemetery. How do we make the cemetery feel safer for people to come and visit? And we are always willing to meet somebody down in town and give them a ride, or we know we have scheduled tours through the spring through fall, you know, at least once a month, where so people can come in a group and you can bring people with you. You know, we're trying very hard to recognize the various barriers that exist and to meet them. And, you know, and I think one of the big things is also for the queer community, and particularly, you know, we tend to think of families as this person and this person, right? And then their children or this and that. And one of the challenges of modern life is, how do we define family? How do we define intergenerational community? Again, we aren't farming communities anymore. We're not living with a family that has 12 kids and, you know, and is related to everybody around them, and everybody comes together to work. We're building that for ourselves. Right now, death certificates in Vermont don't recognize different family structures, right? There's people that are completely left out of the ability to legally have the right to be present with the planning or the dying, or, you know, or the process of making decisions after somebody dies. And again, the sooner you come to the planning process, the sooner you can try to find ways to keep people included. But my hope is that, you know, I think that education and advocacy go together, so that the more people, you know, the more introspective you are about what was missing in your own training as you do this work, or how are people in my community being othered from this, then the more people you can invite into the conversation. And again, right, then you start to get past those stuck places, and then it's like, what needs to change systematically to support people? And how do we better support people of different languages, different family structures, all of these things? Because death is universal. We are all going to die. You know, like, I hate to say it, but it is very true. We are all going to die, and we all desperately care about how that happens. And it, you know, grief is a very unique process. It's incredibly individualized, but everybody's got something that's going to matter to them. And right now, there's an awful lot of people that aren't going to get that, not because the system is malicious, but because the system wasn't designed by people that looked like them or thought like them or loved like them. And we're in a very different place in 2024, so we can start to update all of this.
I think so.
And probably the most marginalized community in all of Vermont, you know, regardless of race or background or language, is right now there's a huge class issue in Vermont. And it is, you know, it is difficult to die in Vermont even when you have a lot of financial resources, but it is very hard to die here if you don't. And so I think one of the big systematic changes that we need to make in this state is, how do we better care for people that come to life without, end of life without resources? without a place to die, without the support that they need. And that's another thing where communities can really start to come together. You know, we're grappling as a state with a growing unhoused population, with a population that's devastated by addiction and mental illness and not getting enough treatment. And you know, and that is far worse for people that have other aspects of marginalization as well. But it's just in general, we have these areas where we know we have to do better. But it's not just in life. We have to do better for these people at the end of life as well. And keeping that conversation in the forefront is really important when we're coming up on the fact that this state is going to be very, very old. For, you know, a huge percentage of the population is going to be over 65 in the next 5 years. And we do not, as a state, have the resources to support them. Right. And I can't state that with enough urgency, is that that's going to take both major changes at the State House, but also incredible changes in how we as a community come together. And COVID taught us a lot about the power of mutual aid and coming together. And I just think that we need to really turn those resources to how do we support people that are dying, because we're out of time to figure it out, right? And we're going to need to come together and do it.
Yeah, and so as we wrap up this conversation, just this real emphasis on community.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the things that I'm taking away is continuing to have those conversations with friends. I know that many towns host death cafes, and I think that there's a national website you can check out. In Heinsberg, Vermont, there are death cafes. I think it's relatively easy to look online to see how you might run one yourself. I know I'm planning to host one with a friend, and to just bring it up at a dinner party.
Yeah, don't be afraid to ruin dinner.
I know, I've become that person. And then also programs, I know, like Going with Grace is a death doula program, the UVM Death Doula Network, or Death Doula program.
The biggest plug that I can put in here is not one of the training programs, but to become a hospice volunteer. So we have this incredible system throughout the United States where people can get support at end of life through hospice. It is incredibly underutilized in Vermont. It is also understaffed and underfunded. You know, it is not a perfect system, but it is a really wonderful gift to give people who are dying. And most people are really reluctant to start. The sooner you start, the better. But what makes hospices work are volunteers. And most hospices in Vermont had very robust volunteer populations up until COVID happened. And then we had to change everything. In order to keep people safe, we had to keep people home. And there's hospices now that have like 1 to 3 volunteers total. And it is just a really wonderful way to figure out, you know, for people that are drawn to this idea of how can I support someone at the end of life, to figure out what it is in you that you can really offer somebody. I feel like, you know, and I teach in a bunch of training programs. I don't want to say don't do the training program, but I feel like they almost kind of approach this more idealized way of dying, where people have resources, where people have thought about it, where people are prepared. That's not the way most Vermonters come to the end of their life. So when you're working as a hospice volunteer, you not only see what are the unique challenges in Vermont, but how do you specifically respond to them, and how can you help people? And ultimately, being a death doula is about being present with people who are dying. You meet them where they are, and you take them where they need to go. And there is no more valuable training than doing it. And most hospice trainings overlap enormously with death doula trainings in terms of the skills that you're going to learn. And it just gets you in contact with people so you can practice what it is. And, you know, and either fall in love with it or fall out of love with it or figure out something else that you want to do. But you're also, again, community and serving your community immediately, as opposed to kind of these other training programs where they are teaching you how to support people in this way, but a lot of people also need to make a living doing this. And again, there's just too many barriers right now in Vermont for many people to be able to access paid care. And I don't want to discourage anybody from being a doula, because we all should be doulas. We're building the network. You know, well, anybody that's called to it, I think, should pursue it in some way. But it is just one way to really kind of do it all, you know, in terms of serve community and learn the skills and figure out what it is that you can do as a professional, is to get started in a hospice training program.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us today, Michelle. I know that I could talk about this all day with you, and if you are needing more information, you can learn more at memorial.eco.
That's Green Mountain Funeral Alternatives, or cemetery.eco. All E's, no A in cemetery, for the cemetery. And again, on our events section, we've got our tours. So we have a tour this weekend and a tour next weekend. The dates and times are on the website. For that, you can register ahead of time. We also have a couple community events that are coming up. I'm going to be premiering the documentary in Randolph at the Kimball Library on September 10th. So for people that want to see what that documentary is all about, come and see me there. I answer questions afterwards, say you saw me, things like that. But you know, the website is, we're often out in the forest, which means we can't communicate with people easily. Our website is our way of speaking to the public, so really encourage people to get in there, look around, check it out, and come visit and come talk to us. And for people that are interested in the planning part, reach out to me and make an appointment. And yeah, really excited to meet and help people in this way.
Great. And like Michelle said, that there is a documentary, and we'll play the trailer of that documentary, and you can see that at the Kimball Library. What date is that?
Tuesday, September 10th.
Okay. And if I know that I reached out to Michelle as well as another member of my community to host the documentary at our public library, and that might be a possibility as well. So
I would love to come and meet you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
I came to death work late. You know, I thought I was going to be a neuroscientist and went to grad school and all these things first before I discovered this. But I took my first steps when I was 9 months old at my great-grandmother's funeral. Like, I was so incredibly on brand my entire life. A lot of times people think that cemeteries are just for the end of life, or that death care is just for the end of life, right? I mean, obviously you need a death to occur, so sure, but if we want to have better relationships with ourselves, we have to have better relationships with the fact that we're mortal. The sooner we start to try to have that relationship with ourselves, I think the better. And so it's just, again, it's like that sense of, how do you have a safe space to ask those questions? Grief is a way of loving, which is something I talk about a lot, and art is a form of expressing love. So, right, so they all belong here at the cemetery. But that's, I like this concept, this idea that the cemetery is an integrator. So it's not just that the one relationship that happens here is that people bury people that they love and they take solace from the land, right? It's that people can come in here and create art and, you know, ask questions. They can take knowledge. They can leave a piece of art. They can, you know, learn about the birds. They can just come and be in silence by the river. I mean, whatever it is that they want. They can be in continual giving and back relationships, you know, giving and taking relationships. And
I've just noticed such a big difference in people being able to do it themselves, that it's not something that requires special equipment. You're literally just lowering a weight down. And it's very quiet. So, yeah, it's a much more gentle way of experiencing someone's death and interment.
There's all these parallels to birth with death. There's sort of this internal process. It's a bit like a labor. Shrouding a body is a lot like swaddling a baby. You're sort of tucking it in. And lowering the body into the grave, I mean, it is. You're giving the body to the earth. I mean, it's like gently putting something, you know, laying a body into the crib. I mean, our baby into the crib. It's just these things that you do gently and deliberately, and they're acts of love, and they're these parallels. And so I think that, like, for us watching it, we can connect and see those parallels, but I think for people experiencing it, even if they're not conscious of it, they still feel that act of love aspect of it.